Well, thanks, Todd, for that wonderful introduction. It's a pleasure to be here and see so many people here at this talk and to be part of this wonderful conference, this first Word on Fire conference. I feel honored to be here. And so my talk this afternoon is on evolution in Catholic theology. And it's sort of two talks that I'm going to give. The first talk, the first part of the talk is going to look at and address, as you can see, order, chance, and purpose. It's going to look at the apparent dichotomy between chance and purpose as often sort of set up in an evolutionary context. The idea that are we the chance product of evolution or are we the purposeful intention of the divine mind, right? And that is sort of to set up the framework of how, as Catholics, do we look at evolution, right? The second part of the talk is a little bit more sciencey. That's where I feel a lot more comfortable in that part of the talk as a scientist. And that's looking at the order and the chance that's a part of evolution. I think often when people talk about evolution or when evolution is presented, the chance aspects of evolution are emphasized, and the order that Father Spitzer was talking about just a moment ago and how that affects and directs evolution is missed. And I think evolution is really an ordered process, and it is a way in which you can see the underlying order of creation revealed in a very, very profound way. And so that's sort of the second part of the talk. Okay, so to get started, though, I want to sort of frame sort of the direction that I'm heading and where I'm coming from. And there's no better way to do that from a Catholic perspective than to turn to the late Pope Benedict. All right. I don't think anybody in the Catholic world, certainly no pontiff, has ever thought as deeply and as profoundly about evolution and creation as Pope Benedict did. And so I have a quote here. This is from his inaugural homily when he was installed in 2004. And he says, "We are not some causal, meaningless product of evolution. Each of us is the result of a thought of God. Each of us is willed, each of us is loved, each of us is necessary." And if you look at this quote and you read this quote and take it sort of out of the greater context of what Benedict has written on evolution, you might be under the impression that it's an either-or thing that he's putting out. Well, you're either evolution or creation. But if you look at the words he uses here, right, he says we are not some causal and meaningless product of evolution. He's not saying that the human person is not in part the product of an evolutionary process. He's cautioning against one sort of vision that tries to reduce the human entirely to an evolutionary explanation. And that's what he's cautioning against here in this quote. And I think the way he approaches evolution and creation is best illustrated in the short book that came out. It's called In the Beginning, A Catholic Understanding of Creation and the Fall. Okay, so this book, it's a very short book. I highly recommend it. It's 4 homilies that he gave in the 1980s. That got put together in a book, and it goes through creation, the fall, and how do you understand these things in light of maybe modern science. And I think this quote here illustrates sort of his thinking on how you approach this topic, and it's sort of the framework of how I'm going to approach what I'm talking about this afternoon. He says, "We cannot say creation or evolution in as much as these things correspond to 2 different realities. The Genesis creation account does not, in fact, explain how human persons come to be, but rather what they are." Right? And vice versa, the theory of evolution seeks to understand and describe biological developments. It says, to that extent, we are faced here with 2 complementary rather than mutually exclusive realities. Right? So he's pointing out that the science of evolution is something that can explain certain aspects of what it means to be human, but it's not going to be able to explain the entire thing. What is the human person? What are we intended for? What is our purpose? Is not something the evolutionary process is going to be able to explain, but that's something that you find in Catholic theology and in Genesis, right? So, but both of those things have a truth to them, and how do we bring those truths together? And that's the approach that he takes throughout all of his writings on this subject, and that's the approach that I'm going to take here in this talk. Okay? Now, the first thing that I want to do to set sort of the stage is to talk about the Catholic meaning of creation, okay? And just as a disclaimer, I'm not a Catholic theologian, but you really can't talk about evolution without having an understanding of what we mean by Catholic understanding of creation, right? And you can have a whole talk on this, you can have a whole class on this, people write volumes on this, but what I want to focus on are 3 points that I think are critical to keep in mind when you're discussing evolution, right? Because it allows you to put evolution into the proper context, okay? So the first point is that the universe owes its existence to God. And this is something that not only, is, part and parcel of Catholic theology, but as Father Spitzer talked about this morning, there's a lot of sort of scientific evidence that it's hard to understand how we live in this complex, ordered universe without implying that there's some creator, right? But when we talk about the universe owes its existence to God, we want to point out this is not just, God starts the whole process and then walks away and lets sort of an evolutionary process play out. But the universe is dependent upon God at every moment for its existence. The universe being a contingent entity can't bring itself into existence. So for every moment, God's creative act is a metaphysical principle. It upholds us. The only reason I'm able to speak right now is because God is creating me at this particular moment, right? And creating all of you at this moment. It's an ongoing thing. The second point is that we as humans as a species, owe our existence to God, right? And that in much the same way the universe owes its existence to God. And that it was that God deliberately intended to create humans, that it was a particular event, right? It's not as if God started an evolutionary process, looked down 200,000 years ago, turned to St. Michael and said, look, there's an interesting hairy hominid running around in Africa. I wonder what that is. No, God, from the very beginning, had humans in mind, right? The last point is that, God created man in his image and that we are a unity of body and soul, right? And our soul is made manifest, at least in this life, in our earthly body, right? And that we are a unity of both spirit and matter, right? And Genesis kind of has this beautiful, language in the second creation account about the dust of the earth, this physical dust, being animated by the breath of God, the Spirit of God, right? And so with these 3 things in mind, I think that can set the level of expectation we should have for the science of evolution, okay? So what can the science of evolution sort of tell us about nature, about humans, and what might it not, okay? So to remember that modern science, when I'm talking about science, I'm thinking of modern empirical science, a science that, not the sort of medieval definition of science, which is quite a distinct thing. But science, modern science, is a tool, right? And just with every tool, they can be used for certain purposes and they're not good for other purposes, right? A hammer is good for driving a nail. It's not so good if you want to make a fine cut on a kitchen tile. It's not the right tool for the job. So there's certain questions that we shouldn't expect science to answer, right? And so science can describe the structure of the universe, right? But science is not the tool to answer the question of why the universe exists in the first place, or why this specific universe exists, right? Likewise, given the fact that, humans are a unity of body and soul, science is not going to be able to explain the totality of man. So the science of evolution cannot explain the totality of man because science is only going to be able to explain the material aspects of the human person. And the human person is more than just a material being. However, our material nature, our physical body is not something that is bad. It's a good thing, and it affects who we are and how we interact with each other and how we present ourselves to each other, right? So what is the church's position on evolution? I get this question, I teach at Franciscan University, and I get this question from students all the time. What's the church's position on evolution? Well, if you ask what's the church's position on the science of evolution, the answer is there is no position, right? So you think about it, that the church has no official position on scientific theories, if they are scientific theories. So the church doesn't have a position on cell theory, the idea that all living organisms are made of cells. That's not what the church does, right? The church is not, in the business of developing and building scientific theories, although you'll hear, in some of the other talks about the church's role in building and funding science over the millennia, right? But what the church does, when the church does talk about evolution in particular documents, it does two things. One of the things that you see over and over again is that there will be statements regarding the proper scope of evolutionary theory, right? And that's what you can see here in this quote from Pope Pius XII from Humani Generis. And this was actually the first official church document that references evolution, right? And this is, almost 100 years after Darwin, right? And he says, the teaching authority of the church does not forbid that, in conformity with the present state of human sciences and sacred theology, research and discussions on the part of men experienced in both fields take place with regard to the doctrine of evolution, and in this case he's referring to the science of evolution, insofar as it inquires into the origin of the human body is coming from pre-existing and living matter, right? So he's putting it, here's the scope of what evolution could, in theory, explain, right? What he then goes on to say after that is to then condemn sort of philosophical theories that often get appended to evolutionary thought, right? So he sort of warns against people that would append evolution to materialism or things like that. And he's not the only one. Every time, usually when a pontiff talks about evolution, you'll see a statement that does that. And I'll just put up another one. This is from John Paul II, where he warns against sort of the scientific materialism or the scientism thought that gets appended to evolution. He says theories of evolution, which because of the philosophies that inspire them regard the spirit, the soul as emerging from living matter, as that you can explain the soul based on science, right? Or it's a simple epiphenomenon that has no sort of real value of that matter, are incompatible with the truth about man. So what he's warning against is sort of this materialistic view, this scientism view that, we can explain the whole human person via evolutionary science, right? And the idea that man is nothing more than a material being. Scientism, the philosophical theory that sort of animates these type of things is something that's sort of inherently self-contradicting. The idea that science can answer every question that is not a scientific statement. And so I'm not going to go into that right now. Ed Fazer has many, many good articles, if you're interested in that, sort of addresses that argument that's often attached to evolution, one of these bad arguments that are there. What I want to focus on is a different argument that's often attached to evolution. This is this chance and purpose argument, okay? And that's what I want to focus on and talk about how the church sort of integrates chance and purpose. Okay? So this is the argument that I want to address that is often put forward by evolutionary biologists or scientists, most of whom have some materialistic or scientific bent. They argue, well, evolution as a process is influenced by numerous chance events, right? Well, if that's the case, then man could not be the intended product of an evolutionary process. Therefore, there's no God who lovingly planned for us or made us in his image, right? So if it's just chance all the way down, then there could be no purpose. So they might argue, about 65 million years ago, there was an asteroid that is thought to have crashed into the Yucatan Peninsula and triggered a major climatic shift that led to the extinction of the dinosaurs, and that allowed for the mammals to diversify, particularly primates, and eventually the primates to diversify to give rise to hominids and man. So they argue, well, look, if that asteroid doesn't hit the Yucatan Peninsula, man never would be here, right? So man's only here because of some chance event. Therefore, it's not something that God planned or could be purposeful. The fact that we're here is just we're the lucky winners of some cosmic lottery that sort of happened, right? That's sort of the argument here. Okay, and there's a quote from a biologist there that sort of lays out this argument, but it's basically the one I just said, that he says that the message of evolution is that there's no purpose and so forth. Okay? So how do we address this argument, right? Well, there is certainly chance events that occur during the evolutionary process. And a lot of people often use the term randomness, but evolution is not random in any real respect. And I put it in quotes. Randomness is a very specific definition scientifically, and with evolution, it's mainly chance events that we're talking about, not randomness, okay? And I'm always struck by particularly students that have an issue of reconciling chance and purpose when it comes to evolution, but don't recognize that the ability to recognize chance and purpose is something that affects your everyday life and who you are. So our existence is filled with chance occurrences, right? So, I mean, you are a chance occurrence. The sperm and the oocyte that fused to make you was actually, in a sense, a chance occurrence, and that this sperm did not, there was no physical law that it had to fuse with this oocyte, right? So when I talk about a chance event, I'm not talking about something that is uncaused. I'm talking about sort of two events that have their separate sort of causal history that just sort of intersect by chance. They one is not necessarily dependent upon the other, right? So you see this picture here of a guy walking down the street. His causal path is, I got to get to the store and buy some milk. And then you've got this piano falling, and his causal path is, gravity, and there's a rope that got cut and it's falling, right? And so this guy walks underneath there and he gets hit. That's a chance occurrence, right? There's two intersecting events that are both caused, but they're not dependent upon each other, right? And I would say that evolution poses no new issues regard to chance and purpose than anything else that we deal with in our lives. We need a way of integrating chance and purpose irrespective of evolution, right? And the way we integrate chance and purpose for everyday events in our life is going to be the same way we integrate it for evolution. And the way it goes back to Aquinas. So the church has integrated this for centuries before evolution even came along, right? And this can be seen particularly in the way that we look at God as a cause, right? And so in our normal everyday existence, like when we're walking down the street and pianos are falling and so forth, we either say, well, the piano falls because of a chance event, the rope just happened to break, or the piano falls because I'm up there and I don't like this guy and I'm going to push the piano on top of him. There's a purposeful sort of event. So it's either purpose or chance. It's either me or it's gravity. So it's an either or thing when we're talking about causes that operate in the world around us by material created things. But God is a cause in a totally other way. And that's what Aquinas talks about, the primary causation of God versus the secondary causation of creatures, right? So God is the cause of the existence of everything, right? As primary cause, nothing exists outside of his providence, right? So anything, any action, whether me speaking right now, or gravity, if I drop the mic, it's going to fall down. Gravity only operates because God allows that to occur. He sustains existence of everything at every moment. And so when we talk about something that happens by chance, right, that is something that, as we look at it, is chance, but it only happens as chance because God allows it to do what it does. So think about asteroid hitting the Earth, right? The Earth only goes around in its orbit because it's following because of gravity and certain physical laws. Asteroids only do what they do because they follow certain laws, but they do it because God allows them to exist and do what asteroids do, and Earth to exist and do what it does, right? And so that chance event, the asteroid hitting Earth, is only occurs because God allows it. So nothing occurs outside of God's providence, even chance events. And this is the famous quote from Aquinas here in the Summa, where he talks about chance, and he uses the term contingency instead of chance. He says, the effect of divine providence is not only that things should happen somehow, but they should happen either by necessity or by chance. You think of by law, like the law of gravity, or contingency or chance. He said, therefore, whatever divine providence ordains to happen infallibly and of necessity happens infallibly and of necessity. And that happens from contingency, what the divine providence conceives to happen from contingency or chance. Because nothing can happen outside of God's providence, given that nothing can exist outside of God's providence. He's the primary cause of everything. Everything else in the world, in the universe, is contingent. Now, another thing that often I think fuels into this inability to see the sort of the unity of the harmony between sort of a chance event and God's providence is the fact that chance really depends on one's perspective, right? So the example I gave of the asteroid hitting the Yucatan Peninsula, right? From our perspective, that looks like it's a chance event as far as we can tell, right? It wasn't as if the asteroid was sent to hit the Yucatan Peninsula. But suppose 65 million years ago, there was an alien civilization that was able to make it to our solar system, and they had a spaceship where they could bump into the asteroid. You guys read about this summer, like NASA did this. They bumped a spaceship into an asteroid and moved it a little bit. Very small deflection. But suppose there's an alien civilization that 65 million years ago came to our solar system, and we're just having fun. Let's try to hit some asteroids. We're going to bump them into the Earth. Well, from our perspective, we'll never know. From our perspective, that was a chance event. But from their perspective, that was clearly a design. They were trying. They had an intention to do that. So you could see, even from a human perspective, things that are chance from one perspective might not be chance from another perspective, right? And this is even more magnified when it comes to God, right? We often try to think of, because of our limited minds, we often anthropomorphize God. We think of God operating in the way we do, right? But God is not stuck inside time in the way we are stuck inside time. And so for God, the notion of chance doesn't even make sense from God's perspective, right? And this is a quote from Ernest McMullen, who is talking about how chance and purpose might work in evolution. And he says, talking about the emergence of humans in an evolutionary process, he says, it makes no difference whether the evolutionary appearance of Homo sapiens is inevitable. Like, it had to have happened. There's no other way. There was no chance events involved at all, right? Or if it was entirely unpredictable from the human standpoint, from our standpoint, right? He says, either way, the outcome is God's making, right? From the biblical standpoint and from the biblical standpoint could be said to be God's plan. He said, terms like plan obviously shift meaning when the element of time is absent, right? And God is not bound by time. God is there's no before or after with God. For God to plan is for the outcome to occur. So when God creates, the outcome occurs. When we decide to do something, there's an interval until it actually might get done, or it might never get done. That's not how God works. He's outside of time. So there's no interval between the decision and the completion. So the terms like plan certainly shift meaning for God, right? And so I think the idea that chance and providence are at odds with each other is something that's foreign to Catholic thinking. Right, and regardless of your position on evolution, it's foreign to Catholic thinking to think something that's chance has to fall outside of God's providence. They're not in competition. Okay, so that's the first part of the talk, and what I'm going to do now is switch a little bit to talk a little bit about the role of chance in evolution. Right, and this portion of the talk, a little bit more science that comes into it. Okay? And some of it builds off nicely. I'm glad that Father Spitzer talked right before me, because some of it builds off some of the things that he was saying this morning. Okay? So what is the role of chance or contingency in evolution? Okay? Well, chance certainly plays a role in evolution, as we talked about already. You just think of the asteroid hitting the Earth, all right? But I'm going to make two arguments about this. That this chance, I'm not denying there's a lot of chance events that occur in evolution, but it's secondary to the underlying order in creation, this underlying order that Father Spitzer was talking about this morning, or this afternoon. All right? I'm going to make the argument two things. One, that this order is essential for evolution to work at all. Like, evolution doesn't get off the ground. This order is a gift to evolution. Right? It doesn't produce it. It needs it. It's absolutely dependent upon this order, right? So that it's primary, right? And the second, and I don't think many people, a lot of times people don't sort of appreciate that, but it's almost like a trivial point as we get to it. But the second point that I'm going to try to make is that this order actually directs the evolutionary process, right? So the evolutionary process, even though there are a lot of chance events, right? The chance events are there and allow to uncover the underlying order in creation. And it's almost like how Aquinas talks about sort of the potential in matter, right? There's this potential that's inherent in the physical world based on the way that it's structured, and the evolutionary process uncovers that potentiality. I'll try to make the argument for that, okay? So the first one is, I think, a little simpler to make. I'll spend less time on that. Now, I'm saying evolution is an interplay between order and chance, okay? And this order is essential for the evolutionary process to work at all. So why, when you think about the evolutionary process, well, what do you need for the evolutionary process to work? Well, for evolution to work, or for evolution to even get off the ground, right, you're going to need to have some complex ordered entities like you or me, or even a cell or a simple protocell. And they have to be complex and relatively stable, right? So I think the foundational question, why do we exist in a universe that allows for stable, ordered, complex things to come into existence? So here's a picture of me from about 10 years ago, right? And you can tell, I'd say I'm relatively stable. Maybe not mentally, but at least physically I'm stable. I got the same big nose and narrow eyes there that I had 10 years ago. My nose isn't getting bigger or smaller. My eyes, I'm a stable physical entity and relatively. You might ask, well, why am I a stable physical entity, right? A stable ordered entity. Well, because the molecules, like the proteins that make me up, are relatively stable and ordered. The proteins that make up my nose are pretty stable. They don't fluctuate in and out of existence, right? Now, they do break down, and you have to make new ones and so forth, but they're relatively stable. Why are the proteins that make me up stable? Well, not to give anybody bad flashbacks from high school or college chemistry, there's a periodic table of elements. The reason they're stable is because there's about 80 stable elements in the universe. You can make more, but they're not stable. But there's roughly 80 stable elements. Right? Carbon is a carbon element. Is a carbon atom is a carbon atom is a carbon atom. Right? It takes a lot of energy to destroy these things. Right? They're very, very stable. Why is it that those 80 elements are stable? Right? Well, they are stable because of the order that you find at the subatomic level, and this is the order that Father Spitzer was talking about earlier. So the reason that those elements are stable is because the strong nuclear force that holds together the nucleus is set at a very certain level, right? The size of the electron and the charge of the electron are set at a very specific level. And so you can see at each level, we explain the order at one level by going down to a lower, more fundamental level, right? At a certain point, you reach a foundational level of order where science can't go any further, right? They can describe the order on the subatomic level, but they can't explain that order by going to another level, right? There's a foundational level of order that just is, and it's a very beautiful order, right? But there's a point where science can't explain it. That order is sort of a gift to creation, right? And that order at that level is essential to get 80 elements, right? If the order is different, like Father Spitzer said, you have a universe that has nothing but hydrogen, and you ain't going to get you or me with just hydrogen, right? That's not going to happen. So that order leads to the order of these 80 elements, which allows for the order in the proteins, which allows for the order in organisms. And that order is a gift. Evolution doesn't produce that order. That order is there in creation and allows evolution to even get off the ground. Okay? All right. So that's the first sort of argument about the order in evolution. Right? The second one has to do with the direction of the evolutionary process. And I would argue that the order that we find in evolution, or we find in creation, actually directs and sort of influences the evolutionary process. Right? So the argument is that our universe has a very specific physical and chemical structure. Right? So, and that physical and chemical structure that our universe has is going to affect the solutions or the direction of how evolution can work, right? There's certain forms based on the chemical and physical structure that are so robust that evolution will find them over and over again. Right? There's others that, no matter how long evolution runs, won't ever be able to build because they're impossible to build given the physical and chemical structure of our universe. So that order not only is essential for it to get going, but it actually sort of dictates what forms are there. In a sense, it's the potentiality in nature is there at the level of the physics and the chemistry, the potential forms that could come into being. Right? Now, there's a lot of debate in evolutionary theory or evolutionary biologists about this underlying order and the implications it has for evolution. Sort of this famous thought experiment. Right? Remember, evolution, I'm making the argument that this order affects the outcomes of evolution, but there's also these chance events that affect it, right? There's both order and chance, right? The question is, which is more prevalent, right? Is evolution predominantly a chance, contingent process, or is it predominantly an ordered process, right? And so you have this hypothetical a question. What would happen if you reran the evolutionary tape on Earth? So if the Earth is, roughly 4.5 billion years old, if we could go back and start the process again, all right, where would we end up? Would we end up with very similar organisms, or would we end up with totally different organisms, right? So you have two extreme possibilities. The first is that you have a totally new set of organisms, and the late biologist or paleontologist Stephen Jay Gould would be one that argues for this. Basically, the chance events, these chance occurrences, these meteors, these extinction events, or certain, the chance has such a big effect on evolution, it would be totally different if we ran it again, right? The other option is that, well, yeah, the chance is there, but the order is limiting what evolution can do. So if we reran evolution again, we want to get the exact same thing, but we get a very similar outcome, what is called a convergent outcome, right? The timing might be different, of things, but you would get very similar forms that would emerge because of that underlying order, right? And this is what's called convergence in evolution. Now, you can't obviously rerun the evolutionary tape multiple times. You can't do that experiment, right? So how do you adjudicate between these two possibilities? Now, clearly, the truth of most things is somewhere in between. But I would argue the truth is closer to that convergence one. And the reason is that if you look at what happened during evolution, during the 4 billion years of evolution on our planet, what you see is example after example of convergence, where similar forms evolve multiple times, very separate, distinct lineages, right? And there's a wonderful book. This book, it came out in 2003. Simon Conway Morris, he is a paleontologist. He's Christian. This book changed my thinking and my life in terms of my scientific thinking and my thinking about evolution. It's a wonderful book. It talks about convergence in evolution. And he argues and talks about how many examples of convergence there are out there. So one example is the camera-like eye that you and I all have, right? So you have a lens and the retina in the back where the light gets focused on there so you can eventually have the signals go to your brain to sense an image. Well, that camera-like eye that all vertebrates have, a very similar one you find in cephalopods, right? In squid and so forth. So that evolved at least twice. And in fact, you see a very similar type of eye in certain insects, not all insects, but some. But that eye, that camera-like eye, evolved multiple times, like 6 different times at least. So there's something about the underlying structure and order of the universe. If you reran evolution again, I would argue, we'd get a creature that had a camera-like eye, right? If you look at like warm-bloodedness, right, that didn't evolve just once. It evolved multiple times, right? So if you look at echolocation, the form that you see of the fusiform form that you see for aquatic species, it evolved in mammals, it evolved in fish, it evolved in sharks. It evolves multiple times. Why? Because the underlying physics dictates that that's how you get through water if you're going to move. So the evolution is going to find those things because it's driven by the underlying physics and chemistry, right? I'll give you a couple other examples. So this is my favorite one. The convergence of the teeth that you see in a donkey there in the middle and the sheephead fish there to the right. And I came across this past summer in Louisiana. It was at dinner. And a friend ordered that, and he said, I'd never heard of the sheep's head fish. I said, what does it look like? He showed me a picture. I'm like, you're going to eat that? But supposedly it's delicious. I haven't got up the nerve to try it because it reminds me too much of Shrek the donkey. It's got the same weird grin. But you can see they're separated by 400 years of evolutionary history, the donkey and that fish, and they have a very similar sort of tooth form. So that's another example. Another example that I want to give is the example of sort of the branching pattern you see when you have to transport fluid or air in a body, right? or in another organism. So the most efficient way to transport it is to have this branching pattern. We start with a big tube, and it goes to a smaller tube, and it branches into smaller and smaller tubes. Evolution doesn't come up with that solution. That solution is dictated by the physics of moving fluid. That's why the sewer systems you don't have a big tube like this coming into your house for water. You have a small tube and it feeds into a bigger and bigger tube, right? And you see this not only in the blood vessels that, bring blood to and from the heart. You see this branching pattern in the lungs. You see it in the tracheal branching pattern in insects. You see it in roots in the trees and branches. You see this over and over again in evolution because that's the way to move these things in a three-dimensional world. The physics sort of dictates that. Okay? I want to give one more example before I conclude. And this has to do with protein evolution. Because I think there is no better case of how this underlying order sort of drives evolution. And if we reran evolution, again, you would get very similar forms than with protein evolution. Okay, so I'm not going to bore you with too much biochemistry here, but real quickly, proteins are made of amino acids, right? And there's about 20 biologically relevant amino acids, and so a protein is a string of those. So you can think it's a string of letters that you put together. So each one of those balls would be an amino acid. And, because there are 20 possible amino acids that could be at every different position, if you imagine you have a protein that's 100 amino acids long, okay, there are 100 to the 20th power possible proteins. So it's virtually an infinite number of possible proteins that you could have. You would think, well, if evolution ran again, you would get a totally different set of proteins because they're so rare, right? But the interesting thing is, if you string amino acids together, right, like this, you bond them together to make a protein, and you put them in water, because of the chemistry and the way and the physics of these bonds and the way that atoms in that interact with water, okay, they fold into only two secondary structures. The one on the the one on the left is an alpha helix. The one on the right is a no. I'm not good with rights and lefts here. Okay. The one on the right is the beta sheet. The one on the left is an alpha helix. But they fold into only two secondary structures because that's what the chemistry dictates. Right? So evolution doesn't find these. It's just what amino acids that are bonded together will do when you put them into an aqueous environment of the cell. So if you reran evolution again and amino acids were to evolve, and that you find amino acids all over the universe, you find them on meteors, you find them all throughout the universe. They're not just found with biological molecules. They can be made sort of inorganically. But if you string those together, they're going to fold into alpha helices and beta sheets again because that's what the chemistry dictates. And then it turns out that you can only combine these into a certain number of folds, right? And so, let's move that forward. If you look at proteins, there's only about 1,000 different ways of putting these alpha helices and beta sheets together. So if you look to the right, the blue things are the alpha helices, the arrows are the beta sheets. And there's only certain ways, limited ways you can combine those based on the physics and chemistry. And there's only about 1,000 folds that proteins undertake that people have been able to identify. So my argument is if you reran evolution again, yeah, you might string together a different set of amino acids, but they're going to fold into alpha helices and beta sheets. That's what the chemistry dictates. And they're going to fold into maybe not the identical 1,000 forms, but very, very similar forms. And that then is going to be used to make the organism. So you're going to sort of get a high amount of convergence. And that the reason they do this is because the order that's inherent in the physics and the chemistry at the sort of foundational level. Yeah. Right, so to sum up, right, I would argue that we live in a highly ordered universe as described by modern physics, sort of what Father Spitzer was talking about this morning. And this order is essential for evolution to work. Right? It can't get off the ground unless you have this order. And two, that this order highly influences the outcome of evolution, right? That it is sort of, this order sets the parameters of what evolution can do. And this order is inherent in the structure of the universe, right? And so at the fundamental, when you have a universe of our type, there are certain forms that are possible and there are certain forms that are likely to evolve. That's sort of set at the very beginning, right? When they come about, is subject to a lot of chance events and so forth, and the timing might be different, but the forms that you would see, I would argue, are there in a sense from the beginning of creation, right? And they are made manifest over time. It's very similar, I think, to the way Augustine saw creation, sort of the seeds of creation and the potentiality of forms coming out of these seeds that God sort of implants into creation. You sort of think of it that way. Okay, and so in summary, the final thing I was going to point out, the theme of the conference is wonder, right? And I think looking at evolution in this way, I think transforms the questions that we ask about it, and transforms sort of the way I think, particularly for me, the way I look at evolution. So instead of the question, well, how do we reconcile chance and purpose? I think the questions become much more profound and much deeper. So why do we live in a highly, highly ordered universe, right? Why do we live in just the type of universe which these forms, these beautiful forms that you see in the top right corner, can evolve and can come into being and can be sustained, right? Why are we given the ability to comprehend this order and to contemplate this order? And I think those questions are the questions that sort of lead us in the direction of wonder, and what the psalmist talks about, where he says, I will praise thee, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Marvelous are thy works. And not only are we fearfully and wonderfully made, but the universe is fearfully and wonderfully made, right? And that leads us, I think, into wonder. And I think evolution, if we look at it in this way, really is something that drives us towards appreciating this underlying order, and ultimately drives us towards asking those deeper questions. What is the source of that underlying order? Sort of what Father Spitzer was talking about earlier. So thank you for your time. At this point, it's 3 o'clock right now. Is that the time? So I'll stay after. I know there's a 15-minute break, but I'll stay after here in the front. If people have questions, that way people are free to leave and go to a break before the 3:15 talk, right? Is that the next talk? But I'll be up here. I'll be happy to take questions.